So last time we started with the endocrine stuff. We were talking about the differences between the nervous system and endocrine. And so the endocrine, the hormone cells that were secreted from endocrine glands were floating around the bloodstream there and kind of spread out all over the body. And they found their target cell because that target cell had a specific receptor for that hormone, right? And so this cell could be exposed to hormone 2 all at once. It's not going to respond to it, right? It's only going to respond to the one it has receptors for. And maybe it has a hormone receptor 2, which influences hormone 1 or something like that too. But that's how they find their targets. And then what happens when they do find their targets? We had the lipid soluble ones, like the steroids that went through, and they usually affected gene expression, like we gave the case of the anabolic steroids, right, where they build actin and myosin proteins, right, to make bigger muscles. And then we had the example of this water soluble insulin, which when it bound to its receptor in these skeletal or adipose cells, when it bound to it, it had that whole signal transduction, right? The G proteins and adenyl cyclase and cyclic AMP, all that big mess right there that led to some kind of action, right? Protein kinase A. And then the end result was that, you ended up with this insertion of these glucose transporter member channel proteins inside, carrier proteins inside the cell membrane there, right? So that was the effect of the hormone insulin binding, right? This whole series of events. And then also, as mentioned before, we had the whole exocytosis stuff as well. But in the end there, what I talked about was a really simple example of how insulin secretion is controlled. Right? Insulin was secreted by those particular cells in the pancreas, those beta cells. And when glucose levels got too high out of homeostatic, right, physiological parameters, insulin, those cells secreted insulin into the bloodstream. And then they did what we just talked about there, right? They made more cells more permeable to insulin, so they would take it up. And then we also, low blood glucose would also affect these different cells, the alpha cells, to secrete the glucagon, which would end up increasing glucose levels in the cell, right? So that was controlling, insulin or glucagon levels, right? But the factor was blood glucose levels. That was kind of the control of it. When it was out of physiological range, either way, those pancreatic cells detected that change, and those same very cells secreted their respective hormones to deal with that change. We'll see the same when we talked about calcium homeostasis. Right? Calcium levels in the blood are going to control this from the parathyroid hormone, right, which is going to do all that similar kind of stuff, right? That's going to control calcium in different ways, right? Either increase it or decrease it, right? But that's all from calcium level, blood calcium levels circulating around the blood. They're sensed, and then hormone secretion is released accordingly. And we'll talk about that with calcium homeostasis next time. So today we're going to talk it's a little bit more complicated controlled secretion, as well as the action of some particular pituitary gland hormones that you may not cover later on. So I want to kind of get into, right? So, and then the other part of it was that stress response, right? And how is the endocrine system involved in that? So, pancreas stuff, easy. You'll go into the gonad stuff when you get into the reproductive system in Bio 145, as well as some of the other ones, right? But today, when we're talking about this control, we had that chemical changes in the blood, glucose, calcium, et cetera, et cetera. And then we have these other ones, signals from the nervous system, which is going to be kind of related from the stress response one. And then mostly we'll be talking about regulation by other hormones. So the regulation of secretion, right, prevents over or underproduction of any given hormone to keep it at the right level. Right, so we're talking about this whole portion here. How do you control how much and when the cells secrete the actual hormone, right? What's the stimulus? And we'll be talking about this because we'll be talking about the master regulator, the pituitary here, right? So chemical change in the blood, glucose, calcium, a few other things, pH also will do that. And then we'll talk about the stress response a little bit, the control of the adrenal gland, and then we'll, mostly we'll be talking about this other hormonal, right? The hypothalamus and pituitary axis and how it controls this wide ranging group of endocrine cells. All right, so for those structures, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, right, this is a close-up hypothalamus structure, which leads into the pituitary gland. I don't know, you're learning all these structures right here, right? Here's the eyeball or so. If you go straight back over here, you got this red thing here. That's going to be the pituitary gland, right? Just for your size and everything, right? And then the other thing is, do you recognize this structure at all? Not yet, but you will. It's sitting in this little pit right here in the sphenoid bone. So when we go over the skull later, we're going to see the sphenoid bone, right, which is this complicated kind of shape over here. That's the lesser wings of it. And then in the middle, right here, is where the pituitary gland sits, right? This is called the sella turcica, right? So that's one of those things you have to identify. That's where your pituitary gland is sitting, right here, right here. And so the hypothalamus must be somewhere over here in real life. All right, so your hypothalamus and your pituitary gland, right, sitting up there in your skull, right? Your hypothalamus is part of your brain. Pituitary gland is a mix of endocrine epithelial and nervous tissue. So the pituitary gland is the one that's going to secrete several hormones, that's going to control a whole bunch of other endocrine glands. And that pituitary gland itself is controlled by the brain tissue of the hypothalamus, right? And so together, right, these are going to be this really the major kind of center of the endocrine system, right? Because they're going to control so many other things. Even if we don't even discuss what it does for glucose regulation, but it does that too. We'll discuss a couple of particular aspects of what it might do, right? The particular hormones and actions of those hormones. So your hypothalamus, again, that's neural tissue. It's part of your brain. And, here, there's the, picture, there's the hypothalamus. And then this is like a cartoon on each different color here is a group of cells that have a particular input and output. They have a, kind of similar function, right? So you have this, what they call nuclei, right? And we'll learn about this when we get to the nervous system. But if you see the word nuclei for brain, it means this cluster of cells, right? And the hypothalamus has a whole bunch of them. And I just mentioned a couple, just not that you have to know these, except it's good to know this last one here. The hypothalamus we'll see is the master regulator of the autonomic nervous system. So you got these parasympathetic and sympathetic nuclei, groups of cells that control the whole autonomic nervous system. You also have this one, which we're not really going to talk about here, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which goes back over here to this pineal gland back there that secretes melatonin, right? And that's going to control your sleep-wake cycles. So your hypothalamus is just this little clump of tissue that's doing all these amazing things, right? And for our purposes, right, we're going to see how it controls the pituitary gland. But, the hypothalamus, as with any part of the brain, it's receiving all sorts of input, right? Whether directly, it might sense different things within the blood, or it might receive signals from higher parts of the brain or your emotional center, right? So it's kind of at the crux of not only the endocrine system, but your whole like emotional being. But in our case, we'll look at the uh, way that it not only secretes hormones itself, oxytocin and ADH, right? And it's basically just going to do that through this posterior pituitary gland. And then there's also this other nuclei that's going to actually control the entire anterior pituitary gland, right? So this is your pituitary gland. It's composed of these two parts, right? Anterior and posterior, right? The anterior and posterior. These are anatomically and functionally separate portions, right? Again, it's in the sella turcica, right over here. It's that little indent in the sphenoid right there. And these anterior and posterior, right, we're going to look at the differences between those. And before I do that, I want to mention last time when we talked about endocrine secretion, right? Endocrine was secreting the hormones into the blood, going all around the body. Nervous cells were more discrete. They attached to a particular target and released its neurotransmitters, you know, a signal, a chemical mediator, right to a particular cell, right? So this is much more finely controlled. We have a cell in the middle called neurosecretory cell. That's kind of like a combination of these two, right? And really, it's really just like a glorified endocrine cell. You know, it makes up hormones in its body, and then it extends an axon out to a particular region, and then secretes it into the blood there. All right. So these are these neurosecretory cells. So that's what we'll be dealing with today with this hypothalamic cells, right? You have some which are going to make the hormones and secrete these so-called regulating hormones into this capillary network. This is called the hypophyseal porter system. I don't know if I'll discuss that, but you'll learn about it. In the circulatory system, you'll probably learn about these portal systems. And all that means is blood is coming in here. It goes through a capillary network. Right? Usually you have a capillary network that comes into a tissue, comes in as an artery, leaves as a vein. In this case, it comes in an artery, and then it doesn't go back to regular circulation. It goes to this other region down over here into the anterior pituitary gland. So we're going to see these cells of the hypothalamus. They're going to release these controlling hormones into the pituitary, where they're going to regulate and make these pituitary endocrine cells secrete their hormones. Right? So that's these secretory cells. They're putting it into the bloodstream. Meanwhile, the posterior ones, really they're just using this posterior part as a conduit, right? All they're doing is making the hormones. They're bringing them down here and they're connecting to all these blood vessels that are within the posterior pituitary gland and releasing them right into the bloodstream, right? So the anterior pituitary gland is getting hormones from the hypothalamus. Posterior one is really just like a conduit, right? It's like via the posterior pituitary gland. And then this goes into general blood circulation. All right, so then we're going to start off with this posterior pituitary gland because it's really simpler. Right? And notice that sometimes, right, here's the anterior one is much bigger, right? So sometimes they're flipped, don't get confused, right? The bigger one is the anterior one. They're just flipped directions. So for this posterior one, as I said, you have these neurosecretory cells making their hormones. They're sending them down their axons and they're releasing them into this capillary network, right, that goes out to your general circulation. And there's two hormones that are secreted by these cells. You have ADH is the most common name you'll hear for it, especially when you get to renal system, kidney stuff. Anti-diuretic hormone, and its function is generally going to be to increase water absorption, and we'll see how. And then the other one is oxytocin, right? This is called the love hormone, right? It makes you feel all warm and fuzzy, and you'll learn all about this in the reproductive system. We won't talk anymore about oxytocin, but that's the other one that's released via the posterior pituitary gland. So that's two hormones so far. So let's talk a little bit about this ADH, anti-diuretic hormone. Right? These neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus are secreting them, and they're going to do so because those neurosecretory cells can detect levels of elevated blood osmotic pressure. That is, when the blood, you're basically dehydrated, and so the solute concentration is greater, so you'll have greater osmotic pressure in your blood, right? So these are all kind of related. Dehydration, loss of blood volume, it's going to detect that somehow. Now, what it wants to do is secrete this ADH, and what that ADH is going to do is go over to it's going to go around the whole body, of course, but within your kidney, the kidneys are going to respond by retaining more water, right? So you're low on water or blood volume, and you want to retain more water. So ADH goes down and retains more water, right? So if you have a lot of ADH going on, your urine, for instance, is super yellow because you're reabsorbing all your water in there, right? And then the other thing it does, its original name was vasopressin. Right here, it increases blood pressure by constricting arterioles, right? In certain areas, when you kind of constrict the radius here of those vessels, the blood vessel actually increases, right? So you can increase your blood volume in that way. All right, so this is ADH, right? Kidneys and blood vessels right here. So the bottom line is it's conserving body water by decreasing urine volume, and it raises blood pressure by constricting arterioles, right? Anti-diuretic hormone. The way this works is ADH in the bloodstream, right? Reaches the kidney. There's ADH receptors there, right? So what kind of molecule do you think this is? Lipid or water soluble? Question. Then you'd have to guess. And then you'd know, because you have this whole second messenger thing, cyclic AMP, protein kinase A. And what it does is increase the amount of water channels within your kidney tubes. This is where the urine was being made. You had water in here. You want to reabsorb more back in the water. So what do? You just add water channels over here, right? That's going to reabsorb more water, right? Based on osmosis. Right? And then it's going to go to the other end and back in the body right over here. All right. So aquaporins, right? That's how you do that. You just increase basically the permeability to water. Okay. That's the action of ADH. And this will serve you well if you remember this for when you get to kidney stuff, because that'll be another thing. So just while we're here, right? Think about, a kind of similar thing right here, right? Remember, these cells right here weren't so permeable to glucose. In response to insulin, you get that whole signal transduction cascade, which will include the cyclic AMP, et cetera, and that'll lead to an insertion of a bunch of glucose transporters in, making the cell more permeable to glucose, right? So you can get a kind of trend of what might be going on, like some of the actions of these hormones, how they might affect the target cell. All right, so that's your posterior. That's your posterior pituitary, and that's very simple because really there wasn't anything going on but those neurosecretory cells releasing those two hormones. For the anterior pituitary, what we'll see here is that there's the hypothalamus is going to have 5 releasing hormones and 2 inhibiting hormones secreted from different neurosecretory cells that are going to control the release of endocrine cells in the anterior pituitary gland. What we're going to see here is that these cells are you'll see these releasing hormones, or a couple of inhibiting hormones, right? So what all these hormones are going to do is going to go down to the anterior pituitary gland and affect the secretion of the endocrine cells within the anterior pituitary gland, right? So that's the whole function of your hypothalamic control, right? And so we're going to see these somatotrophs bunch of cells which secrete growth hormone. So you're going to have this growth hormone releasing hormone, or a growth hormone inhibitory hormone, or these thyrotrophs, group of cells that are going to secrete thyroid stimulating hormone. Those are going to be stimulated thyroid releasing hormones, right? So if you see the word releasing or inhibiting, you know they came from up there, and their whole function is just to go down from the hypothalamus into your anterior pituitary gland right here. And then we'll talk about a couple of these particular hormones from the anterior pituitary. This is the larger again of those two, right? Of those two glands right there. And while the posterior one was neural tissue, right? It was really an extension of the hypothalamus kind of. The anterior one is actually derived from epithelial tissue. It's normal epithelial glandular tissue, right? That are going to, those endocrine cells are going to secrete the hormones into the blood there, right? And so you'll have 5 groups of cells that are going to secrete these 6 hormones, right? So they're distinct groups of endocrine cells within the anterior pituitary that's going to release hormones in response to that hypothalamic input, right? And then we'll talk a few about these right here. These are the 7 hormones over here, which we just went over here, and we're really going to talk about this growth hormone over here, right? Growth hormone at first anyway, right? So these are also known as somatotrophs. The somatotroph cells, secrete somatotropin or human growth hormone, right? And growth hormone is going to stimulate, in general, body growth as well as regulating different aspects of metabolism. So we'll get into a little bit of these. When we talk about growth hormone, right, somatotrophs that are going to have particular effects, and it's going to do some of these indirectly through insulin-like growth factors over here, right? And in response to growth hormones, certain cells in your tissues, right, are going to secrete these insulin-like growth factors, and they're going to increase growth of that particular tissue for growth and repair. The other thing that growth hormone does is affect metabolism, right? Metabolism of the cells, right? And what this means is you're enhancing things like lipolysis, right? Breakdown of fatty acids, right? Which is going to increase the use of fatty acids, right? They're going to break it down and use it for ATP production. And you're also going to decrease glucose uptake in most body cells and direct it toward the brain, or rather that glucose is then going to be kind of geared toward the brain over there, right? Because the glucose, this is where the brain needs it most. So this is one of the functions of that, right? And the other thing it does is stimulate liver cells to release more glucose into the blood by breaking down glycogen. That's the sort of general function of growth hormones, right? Some of it's going to be done through these insulin growth factors, right? Stimulating osteoblasts, promoting cell division, all that, right? Accelerating protein synthesis, right? So this is one of the reasons people take these growth hormones, right? Sometimes it's a medical thing where you're using it for repair. Sometimes it's just for bodybuilding, right? So this is your growth hormone, right? Increasing lipolysis and decreasing glucose uptake. For the rest of the body, that's going to increase glucose for the brain. All right, so that's growth hormone, right? And then growth hormone inhibiting hormone from the hypothalamus will also inhibit that whole thing, right? So another one I want to talk about here is this group of thyrotroph cells that are going to secrete this thyroid stimulating hormone. So in this case, these are going to be stimulated by the thyroid releasing or thyrotroph releasing hormone, which is going to lead these cells to secrete thyroid stimulating hormone, right? And from there, we're going to go to the thyroid, right? So thyroid releasing hormone goes into the anterior pituitary and is going to stimulate the cells there to release thyroid stimulating hormone. That goes into the thyroid gland, which is going to release the actual thyroid hormones, right? So there's this 3-step action on this thyroid hormones, right? And you'll see these as T3 and T4, right? So you've probably heard, right, thyroidism goiters, right? You've probably seen pictures like this of iodine deficiency where the thyroid gland, you get this massive thyroid gland, and this could be actually due to either not enough thyroid production from thyroid hormones or too much, right? Either one of those can lead to this enlargement of the goiter right here. This is a big problem, and it's mostly due to, or largely due to lack of iodine in the diet. As we'll see, I'll show you at the end. But, so what happens when you don't get enough thyroid hormone, or you don't get enough in hypothyroidism, or you get too much, right? You'll look at the descriptions right here. You don't have to know any of this, but just kind of get an idea of what thyroid hormone might do by looking at the what happens when there's a gain or loss of function here. Okay? Hyper, too much thyroid, you get weight loss, increased heart rate, intolerance to heat, which means you have a lot of body heat, as opposed to slower metabolism, right? Decreased heart rate, intolerance to cold, right? So a lot of these you'll see nervousness versus like slowness and everything like that, right? Fatigue versus kind of anxiety, right? So these will all be kind of opposite things, and kind of gives you a sense of the importance of what these thyroid hormones might be doing, right? So the other thing is about those iodine, what I said, the iodine deficiency is, iodine here, it's going to be part of the synthesis of the actual thyroid hormone from a basic precursor of tyrosine, right? And iodine is going to be a necessary component, right? So when you don't have enough iodine, these cells might be secreting something that isn't quite right, or don't actually get to secrete them at all. So you'll have a thyroid deficiency, a thyroid hormone deficiency, when you don't have iodine right here. All right, so when it gets into the blood, right, you have thyroid hormone, and it's a lipid-soluble hormone. And no, it actually has some kind of channels, a transporter going through it. So it doesn't actually, I don't think, go through the cell membrane, but it does act in similar ways to those steroid hormones, right? It binds to an intracellular receptor in that case. And what you get from that, right, this is from a binding to mitochondrial receptors, which are going to increase mitochondria output. What does that mean? Increased ATP production. And then the other thing it does is going to be get into the nucleus and activate gene transcription and translation and protein synthesis, which is going to basically increase metabolism as well, right? So the target cell response from thyroid hormone, right, is basically going to increase, just like kind of like growth hormone. It's going to have similar stuff. It's going to end up increasing your basal metabolic rate, your BMR, right? BMR is how your body uses energy, right? And in response to thyroid, right, you increase your basic metabolic rate, right? So carbs, lipids, proteins are broken down, right, more frequently, increase in that. It also increases the use of ATP, right? So your body's generating a lot more energy, breaking down a lot more glucose, right, by making these additional pumps in there. They'll also increase the levels that protein transcription is going to increase enzymes involved in cellular respiration. And like I said, they're going to increase the number and activity of mitochondria, right? Those powerhouse of the cell that's making ATP, right? So now you think back, this increased metabolic rate, right? You think of some of these, right? Hypothyroidism, right? Your metabolism is slowed down, right? You're not really generating heat and stuff like that, right? So all these kind of things, if you think of these, are going to be related to that decreased metabolism, right? Or increased, if hyper. Right? So this is thyroid hormone. It's very important. This is a very big, problem in a lot of places, right? So as far as the control, right, we know how it starts, right? We had these thyroid releasing hormones, but those themselves can detect blood levels of these hormones, the thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, or low metabolic rate, right? So those cells are like kind of detecting information, and they're causing this release of the hormones, right? Which is going to cause those cells here to release the thyroid stimulating hormone, which will cause the thyroid to release those into the blood, right? Once the levels of these are sufficient, right, in the blood, that'll go create a negative feedback and inhibit release of the stimulating hormone as well as the releasing hormone. So basically it's controlled by levels of the thyroid hormones themselves, right? All right, so that brings us just to one quick topic. I want to talk, most of your cells that we're talking about with these hormones are going to be, involved in some kind of negative feedback like that, right? Either the amount of hormone, just like we talked about right over here, or maybe the levels of glucose or calcium or something, pH, right? That's going to kind of stop the pancreatic beta cells from secreting insulin once glucose levels return to normal. So that's how hormone secretion might stop. Or the other part is enzymes in the cell or in the liver, right? As the blood passes through the liver, there's enzymes which break down hormones, right? So enzymes will break those hormones down, right? Or they'll be peed out, basically, right? They'll be let out in the filtrate, and if we don't need them, they'll be excreted, right? So we have to get rid of those hormones too. We'll see this again when we get to the nervous system. All right, so this next one we're going to talk to here about is the stress response, right? And this will involve these ACTH as well as some of the hormones we already talked about here, right? As well as the adrenal medulla gland, right? And so before we get there, let's just look in a background here, right? The hypothalamus, right? Part of the brain, right? It's detecting things like osmolarity, metabolic rate, TH levels and stuff like that, right? It's detecting all sorts of things in the blood itself, or maybe it's getting signals from other hormone or cells rather in the brainstem here or out in the blood vessels, right? That are going to tell it to release stuff, right? So your hypothalamus is kind of monitoring the whole body for your internal body processes. But I just want to point out over here, right? This will be kind of something for later. When we talk about the hypothalamus, right? Osmoreceptors, okay, it picks up the osmolarity of the blood, secretes ADH. Another thing the hypothalamus is going to do actually is going to cause like changes in actual behavior, right? It's going to make you thirsty. It's going to drive you. It's going to impel you to go drink water, right? To go out there, right? So your hypothalamus is super, it's you're going to see it's like kind of at the center of a lot of your behaviors, your motivated behaviors, because of the way it controls, it picks up information and it controls the output like that. So it's a very interesting thing we'll get to when we get to the brain, right? The so-called emotional center of the brain. You look at things you've probably heard about the amygdala and stuff like that, and how it controls like fear and anxiety and stuff. One major output of all these systems is to control the output of the hypothalamus, right? Mostly because it's controlling the autonomic nervous system, right? Your sympathetic nervous system, right? But your hypothalamus is really a really key organ right here. For our purposes today, it's just those regulating the hormones for the most part, right? But it also has a direct role, not in the pituitary gland, but it's also going to send neurons down to this chain of events that are actually going to make the adrenal gland secrete these norepinephrine and epinephrine, right? So that's the other part of this adrenal gland, as well as doing all these other things, right? So as far as the stress response goes, or sometimes known as general adaptation syndrome, right? This is just basically how the body responds to stress, right? And stress is very wide kind of term here, right? Anything that's producing A stress response is a stressor. Could be good stuff, could be bad stuff, right? But any disturbance, right, to those physiological parameters, heat, cold, environmental poisons, anything like that that's affecting it is a stressor, right? And there's all these homeostatic mechanisms that are going to use to counteract those stress, right? And so this stress response, we'll learn here, is going to talk about these three stages, right? The initial fight or flight, a slower, kind of longer term resistance reaction, and then eventually what happens when you do this for too long, right? So just as a reminder, right, neurons, right, they're in the brain or spinal cord for the most part, and then they're sending out their axons out specifically to target cells to do whatever, whereas the endocrine is releasing it into the blood, right? So your hypothalamus, whatever, is detecting some kind of stress in your body, right? Some kind of stress. And really for these ones, you're actually thinking of stuff that you're detecting, right? You're conscious of perhaps, right? Like I said, a bear walks into the room and you get very scared, right? And goes in and somehow it connects to your hypothalamus, and those cells send their axons down the spinal cord, and then neurons there send them out the spinal cord, and they attach to the adrenal medulla over here. And then there, those adrenal medulla cells are going to secrete the epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay, and the effect of that secretion is, for the most part, it's going to kind of get your body ready for physical exertion in some way or another, right? So we talk about the fight or flight, but this is also going to happen when you start exercising heavily, anytime you're like really using your body a lot, right? And so what do you need to get your body ready? Well, you need a lot more glucose because your body's going to need more energy, right? You want to increase your blood pressure, and particularly you want to direct it toward the muscles, right? You're going to increase oxygen, right? You're going to increase the metabolic rate to get that ATP making. And again, you're going to change the blood flow patterns to your brain and your muscles, and really away from all those things you don't need to do at this moment, right? Digestive system, urinary, reproductive, all that kind of stuff is shut down, and you're all concentrated on picking up what's going on in the environment, running away or fighting it, and moving the blood around, right? So huge amounts of oxygen and glucose going toward those with this epinephrine and norepinephrine circulating around your blood, right? So this is epinephrine and norepinephrine. I should say that the other neurons go and innervate the targets themselves, like the heart and your blood vessels and stuff like that, and also affect those directly. Right? So that'll even be a shorter response because it's the nervous system. This adrenal medulla is that thing where, you get scared or you get into a fight, you get angry, and then even after you calm down, your heart's still pumping everything, right, for a little bit. So, that is, this is reduction of blood. This is just kind of showing how your blood pressure might be elevated with the secretion of renin. I'm going to say don't worry about this for exam purposes, but you will know that for when you get to renal and bio 145. Just think about these two, right? All right, so this is your fight or flight response, right? Getting your body ready for action. You're bringing blood to your muscles, your heart's pumping, right? You're breathing heavy, all that stuff right there, right? Short-term stress response. Once the stress is done, the neural activity will stop, and eventually, your adrenaline will break down, whatever feedback mechanism or breakdown will happen there. The second part is the so-called resistance reaction, right? And in this case, again, it's going to be initiated by those hypothalamic releasing hormones, right? And they're going to stimulate the cortico releasing hormones. Are going to stimulate the ACTH, adrenal cortex ones, which are going to stimulate the adrenal cortex, right, to release cortisol. Right? And then cortisol is released into the blood. This is going to have the effect of increasing blood glucose levels, either by gluconeogenesis, right, forming new glucose from breakdown of triglycerides and proteins, right, And they also, and so that means the tissues are going to use the resulting glucose and everything to produce ATP to, keep on the energy or repair any kind of damage that goes on. And the other thing about cortisol is it reduces inflammation, right? So that's part of the cortical releasing hormones, which are going to be part of that. The other ones are ones we already talked about, right? Growth hormone releasing hormones, thyroid releasing hormones, growth hormone, thyroid hormones, and all their effects on increasing metabolic rate, as well as, increasing metabolism and activity, right? Growth hormone, thyroid releasing hormones. All right, so you go back to that on that, right? So this, your adrenaline takes a little while. This is going to last a little longer, right? Than that, and this will keep going right that. So that's great, and it'll last hopefully as long as it needs until those things are cycled through and they're controlled by their own homeostatic, feedback mechanisms. Right? So in this case, increased ACTH from the the anterior pituitary is releasing the glucocorticoids in the blood, and that's going to be detected by the neurosecretory cells, which are going to decrease that secretion. All right, so that's all good. There are times, though, when that keeps going for a long time. You're under stress for prolonged periods of time, right? Like when you're a anatomy student and when you're in nursing school and everything like that, or you're an actual nurse, right? Just long-term kind of stress stuff is going to take its toll on you, right? This constant like energy expenditure to kind of fight off this, keep your body ready level for this action. Right, so this is when you get into the period of exhaustion, right? Your body becomes depleted, right? Prolonged exposure to those high levels of cortisol, right? You've gone through this whole process, and then you start dipping below like the homeostasis, right? In this exhaustion stage right here, right? One of the big things is your suppression of the immune system in a very complicated way, but the suppression of the immune system, there's all sorts of problems associated with long-term stress and autoimmunity and other immune problems. So this is exhaustion stage. Your body's just done doing what it had to do, and it's going on longer than needed when you're faced under constant stress, right? All right. So that's that generalized adaptation response, right? Short-term, long-term, and then exhaustion right over there. So I think that'll do it for this endocrine lecture. Are there any questions?